Welcome to the Bogart Effect, a wealthy wisdom podcast. The following Bogart Effect podcast is intended for general information purposes only. The information discussed is no substitute for personalized investment advice from Bogart or another investment professional. Please see important disclosure information at the end of the presentation. Hello, this is James Bogart, President and CEO of Bogart Wealth. With me today is Morgan Veth, and we're going to talk about the family conversation. So, there's a lot to be said here. And I think really what we're trying to accomplish is to share our perspective on really how do you talk to family members about not only your wealth, but your plans. Some of that impacts them. For example, you think about mom and dad versus grandpa and grandma versus the kids.
Yep.
So not to get into specifics, but what is the family plan?
Yeah, so and today we'll kind of go through, I think, and talk about it from like young children, right, as you and I both have, and how we have that basic fundamental family conversation, investing 101, to when your children kind of start to move into peership with you, right, and starting to bring them in into what's your plan, estate planning, numbers, everything. And then probably the toughest of all, I think, is talking with your parents about their plan and making sure you're in line, know where their docs are, and
so let's start talking about our kids, right? I have kids similar age, and clearly they're not at a point where they can comprehend what money is, but how do you build that plan?
Yep. I think for that, it's not so much like, here's our plan, right? Your dad and I, here's our net worth and what we hope to do. It's really just that financial education. Because if our goal is to transfer wealth to them and just make them good citizens, right? And having that education that you really don't get in school. You get a lot of great things in school. So when I think about the young ones, mine are 9, 8, and 3. So we'll leave the 3-year-old aside. But for the girls, it's really been, what is investing 101? And here's resources and ways to do it. An example I love, so Alex, who runs the management team here, with his 2 daughters, he set up and said, hey, pick 2 stocks that you want to follow. And they had a conversation about it. Now with your kids, it's going to be probably Disney, Netflix, Amazon, Mattel. Like, we know the ones they're going to go for. But, then Alex is able to kind of print it out and show them some basics of like, here's how you analyze the stocks. And they followed them. They each bought a share and started to have conversations about, how's your stock doing this week? And which I love that.
Well, and I've found that's the best way to connect the children. And really, when I say children, it's probably under the age of 18, realistically, right? But that's how they can get engagement and comprehend like what investing is in things that they buy, which tangentially, there's a thesis to be said for an investment strategy should be looking at your kids' spending habits, right?
Because buy what you know.
Exactly. And I'm not going to say I hold true to that, but the point is the largest consumers at this point are millennials and Gen Zs, and ultimately millennials are buying for their kids, right? So there is a lot to be said with regards to how those stocks perform. So similar to what you just said, I think education is paramount with everything. And by the way, that doesn't deviate with any of the age groups. For my wife and I, we've really been focusing a lot on values. And for me, saving is a very important value, living below your means. And really, like, for example, my 6-year-old, she was given some money for her birthday, when, of course, first thing she wanted to do was go spend it. And I said, well, no, we need to save, right? And that was a tough conversation for a 6-year-old to comprehend, because at that point, it's like, well, why do I need to save? I want to buy a toy now, right? And using that as early as you can, I think, when we think about values, think about things that we represent as people, having that conversation with your children as early as possible. So like for Ashley and I, it's philanthropic giving. We're very charitable inclined, but it goes more than just writing that check, like finding the avenue and the mechanism to get the kids involved with that. That's something that aligns with our values. Not everybody is that way. That's fine. But, it's saving, it's giving, and investing, how that all integrates in there. So anything else you want to talk about with regards to the kids?
No, I think the number one thing is also just, we've learned with kids and with ourselves, if you gamify it, right, they're going to be engaged. And so there are a ton of great free resources out there. So we're probably a little bit unique where this is what we live and breathe every day. So the conversation comes a bit easier with the kids. But on, even on Schwab, it's Schwab MoneyWise, wrote it down so I didn't forget. It is a great resource. There's a whole header at the top that's for kids. And there's everything from free lesson plans for teachers. If you're a teacher out there and wanting to think of a way to bring it in, broken down by, kindergarten, fifth grade, and different ways, like free lesson plans to do that. There's some games on there, a great investing app. So I think that's the other thing. We know our kids are on screens these days, right? As much as we want to limit it. But think outside the box, and also in what are different games and ways you can introduce it that they can kind of gamify it and be engaged.
Tangential to this conversation, it is related, but it's not. Let's talk a little bit about the best places to be setting money up for kids. So for example, me with my kids, we have brokerage accounts, UTMA accounts, minor accounts, but one of the things that I always like to encourage, if the kids have earned income, let's get it into a Roth, especially if we're in a situation where we know we're going to be transferring wealth to them. Right. So let's talk a little bit about that. So what are the different account types for kids?
Yep. So Roth for minors is newer, but fantastic, especially if you are self-employed, right, in ways that you can very easily kind of employ your kids, right, at an early age. Then as long as they have earned income, they can contribute to a Roth IRA.
So even if you're not self-employed, if they have a lifeguarding or babysitting, anything that they put on a tax return and they have earned income. And by the way, for mom and dad, one of the things I like to do is, again, coming back to my values, but incentivize the behavior. So if they save it, I match it, right? So it's one where it doesn't harm them, but if they don't save it, they don't get the match, right?
Absolutely.
So it's kind of like this conceptualization of alignment of values. And that's why I talk about, especially with kids, I think it's so important to align what your goals and objectives are. Yeah,
match is great. I mean, right, because we do it in our 401ks, right? Got to get that free money. And so to introduce them and match savings is great. So, I mentioned being self-employed mainly because the younger the kids are, right, then they're probably not, waitressing or doing things. So it's a little bit easier to kind of show that income.
I laugh, but I mean, my kids are models, right? So, you'll see them all over the Bogart Wealth website and each of them get paid to be models.
Absolutely.
And you can rest assured where that money's going is into Roth IRA accounts.
Yeah, I remember at a very young age filing files for my dad. I'd have to get him and go put them alphabetical because that was something I could easily do. It was earned income.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually started working when I was 10, where I actually had a W-2 and it was all on payroll. So I was getting that so that I could start doing some of that saving early on.
Absolutely.
Right? And this is why this family conversation is so important, because I think a lot of the reason I have the embodiment and desire to save is because I learned that lesson so early in life. And candidly, time value of money is extremely important in this conversation. So the earlier you save, the more it will have time to be able to grow and compound. So you put $100 in today, let's just say it goes up by 10%, it's up now 110. That $110 grows by 10%. It compounds and grows bigger and bigger and bigger. So the earlier you get it in, the more money it is. Just tangentially, right? If a child starts savings at 20 years old and they max out their Roth account, which is now $7,000 a year, by the time they're 60 years old, that's about $1.7 million.
Huge.
If they wait 10 years, then it's now $900,000. So the manifestation of, and by the way, that's 10 years, that's just $70,000 of savings, right? So just shows the impact of that accumulated growth. So nice segue. Let's talk a little bit about adulting children, right? So now fresh out of college, they're starting to manifest some of those values that you've been instilling in them so early on. What's that conversation like?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is one where I would say a great one is start to introduce them to your financial advisor, right? I mean, we had a client in December when he was home for college and, set the stage with the financial advisor before bringing him in. Like, how much are we going to talk about, right? We're going through numbers, more kind of high level, but start to introduce them to the people who are helping your team to make these financial decisions, I think is a great way to do it.
So talk a little bit more about that. Like, when is it appropriate to start bringing your kids into your stuff?
Yeah. Oh, it's different, right? I mean, I think that's really going to be different for everyone. But I would say for some, definitely as early as 18. And again, maybe it's not your full, here's my net worth statement, but here's some savings that we do. Talk about gifting. My favorite account to bring them in on at that age is a donor advised fund.
Okay.
Right? So here's a way that we're gifting into it. Personally, how I do it as well.
Let's take a step back. What is a donor advised fund?
Yep.
Okay, right.
Good stop. So donor advised fund is a charitable gift account where you can contribute appreciated stocks. Yep. We can contribute anything, but that's the most common one. I bought stock at $10. It's now $100. I contribute it to this fund. Yep. So you're not paying capital gains. So it's a great and very tax efficient way.
And then it's an account now that you can use for charitable giving.
Now you've got this pool of money you can give out to the organizations that champion your beliefs.
Yep.
Right? So now you've got this family donor advised fund. And I think that's a really great one to kind of start to explain that to your child and even bring them into it. Like, here's how we make some decisions. Letting them have a voice. Like, what are some organizations that you care about, right? Yep. Maybe it's something that they've been volunteering with through school, or another one that comes to mind, and helping them think about those grants. Because with the donor advised fund, let's say my children are my beneficiary on that account, doesn't mean that they just get it when I die, right? Yep. Start to pull it out. It still has to go to a 501c3 that they now get to choose. So starting to introduce it to them at an early age, I think, is a great way.
So when my children transition to college, what are the conversations I should be having with them? And let's say college and then thereafter, right? Yeah. And this is a discussion a lot of clients ask us along the way. What should I be doing as my kids are hitting these milestones?
Yeah. So I think that's one where the different types of accounts, because you're definitely, some are getting jobs in high school and maybe earlier, but certainly in college, I think that's a common one to say, hey, let's talk about a way to contribute and save and do that. Another big one, is estate planning. So when your children turn into adults, your rights to their medical records and things like that change. Yep. And that's a big one that's overlooked. And so I think that's a really good one to say, hey, I should make sure that I'm their medical, care, yep. that I have their
So you're saying we should have a power of attorney on force for the kids?
Yes. Yeah. So I think that's a good one to have for the kids. And again, I think it comes down to, if you've got a trust set up, start talking to them about it. Yeah. Right? I think we both had a CFP professor, maybe at different times, said, if you don't trust them, trust them. Yeah. Right? It's so catchy. That's one reason, but there's a million other reasons that you establish that trust. And so I think it's good to have that conversation with them so they understand, hey, it is to their benefit. We don't necessarily not trust you, but...
Just for audience purposes, let's pull on the thread. Yep. Like, what is a trust real quick?
Yeah.
Right.
So a trust is a way to really designate whatever you want and your wishes through estate planning. So if I leave my kiddo outright as a beneficiary, their age of majority, the money's theirs. Yep. Do with as they wish. When it goes into a trust, you can set any parameters you want. Hey, use it for A, B, and C. You need to be 35. You need to have accomplished these things, right? Yep. Have your own job, whatever it is, to stipulate how and when they can use it.
It's one that you'll find, it's a slippery slope, because a trust is designed, it really can be an extension of you from the grave, right? Yep. So I typically present a trust for 4 reasons. The first is ultimately to avoid probate. Yep. So this is, in my view, my way of protecting the next generation. And I say it that way simply because probate is the legal process of transitioning wealth from one person to another. And when it goes through probate, it's public. It's a court record. And the reason that it's so important for this is because, frankly, if you're transitioning wealth that does not have a named beneficiary designation, well, it's now a public record forever. Mm-hmm. And I use the example a lot of times. It's like, let's say my children, they're driving, they get in a car accident, someone gets hurt. It was completely innocent in nature, but ultimately someone gets hurt. Well, there's most likely going to be a lawsuit. Yep. Anything that they inherit through public record, you can rest assured it's probably going to be named in that claim. So my viewpoint on why I want a trust is simply because I have a lot of reasons for trust, but one of the reasons I want it for my children is to protect them, yep. right? And so avoiding probate is a very big part of that. I want it to be private as that wealth is transferred to them. The other 3 reasons, ultimately, we talk about a lot. 2 are kind of the same, but it's the creditor protection, yep. similar to what we were just describing there a second ago, but it's also the divorce protection. I call it the no good son-in-law, no good daughter-in-law provision, but you don't want your children to inherit anything you've accumulated, and then ultimately they get divorced and it gets split up. So having language in there. And then the 4th, which is what you were just talking about, which is giving them guidance. More often than not, your children have not had to do what you did to accumulate wealth and save. So they don't have that level of appreciation, right? So we're just trying to contextually give them guidance. Now, I don't know about you, but from my perspective, with a lot of clients, some say, no, I want to give them a lot of guidance, a lot of rigidity to it. Some will say, I don't care, I'm dead. Give them the money. And my wife and I, let's just say some friction on that conversation, because I have my viewpoint, my value system. Not saying that hers is different, but it's a different perspective. And so this is where I think as mom and dad, as we're having these conversations, I come back to values because it's so important to me. But the documents also want to reflect that conversation as well. And to your point, I know this is tangential, but bringing the kids in early on where, again, you don't have to share the numbers, but you can share ultimately what the goals and objectives are. I think that's an important conversation to be having. I mean, as early as the kids are, I'd say, responsible enough to handle that conversation. I've seen cases, like you mentioned the one earlier, where it was an 18-year-old, very mature, very responsible. I've seen cases where a 40-year-old is not responsible or mature enough, it does vary between. Yeah. So now I want to pull on the thread of, let's say a child is graduating from college. What's that typical conversation? I know it's a little bit unrelated to the parent one, but what should the parents be teaching their children or engaging us for at that point in time?
Yeah, I think a big one that we do with, my clients, if I'm sitting down with their children, is, hey, I've got this job offer. Here's like the pages of benefits. Like, what the heck does this mean? What is an HSA? Should I be thinking about a health savings account? Looking at that company match, right? Making sure you're getting it. So I think a lot of it is, hey, here's the benefits that you're often going to find with your new employer. How the heck do I navigate them and make sure I'm utilizing them?
And the 401k, can't emphasize that enough, right? It's so many instances free money, but I find, especially with current generations, from a cash flow perspective, it's like, I can't afford to save. Well, I'm going to argue you can't afford not to save, right? I mean, it goes both ways, but I think it comes back to the parents. It's important to emphasize that. And again, I'm not going to speak to me personally, but it's one of those, like, if you need to do something to help incentivize that behavior, then maybe let's have that conversation as well. Now, how should the kids be engaging mom and dad's financial advisor? I mean, Bogart Wealth, a big part of what we do is offer our services to the kids, but really, how should they be using us?
Yeah, I would say, again, it's a little bit different. So for a lot of my clients, I like to make myself available to their children, right? Because it is very much a family conversation. Even if we're saying, hey, I'm segmenting this, I'm not going to share information across, but I like to meet with them probably once a year. I would say most of the times kids don't want or need to meet as frequently, right, as the adult parents do. Or sometimes I actually say, hey, they might want to meet with maybe a junior advisor, but having a different advisor, because yes, I trust Bogart, mom uses y'all, but maybe we just want to have someone different. So sometimes you see that, and I'm like, that's sensible.
Which, I would say that it's important if anybody's looking for an advisory firm. Candidly, I think that's one of the offerings that really just needs to be in place. Selfishly, I think of how we've structured the firm. We wanted to have that relationship in case something happens to mom and dad, right? So we're not just mom and dad's advisor, we're part of the family offering, right? And I think that's an important one. So let's segment or transition over and talk a little bit about parents, right? So I'm at the age now where my parents are getting older, right? And I think one of the conversations we're having with a lot of our clients is coming back to Medicare, and then transitioning over to long-term care needs, truthfully, maybe occupationally, my parents are obviously very forthcoming with me, but but that's not common, right? I'm 38 years old. I don't think a lot of parents at that point are sharing with their children, adult children, even at this age, right? So how do you and I, right, at our age, or let's just say into our 50s, how do we engage our parents to have that conversation?
Yeah. This is definitely the hardest one. You're right. I mean, easier for us because I am my parents' financial advisor, right? So we're talking about it all the time. But, even personally, Andrew and I are about to meet and update our estate plan in 2 weeks. So I think as you're going through it, just saying to your parents, hey, I'm kind of about to update it. When did you and dad last update your estate plan? Or where do you keep the documents, right? If we don't know where these power of attorney, where the will, where all the documents are, then good luck, right? Well,
and I think of my dad, right? I mean, my dad's fortunate. He's got some savings and he's got real estate in 2 states. And of course, he just recently went through a passing of his parents. So now it's top of mind for him. And that's then what started the conversation even with he and I. And, it's one of, all right, well, what is your goal and intent, right? And I think that's a part of this conversation. Estate planning, in my opinion, is the perfect one to kind of transition in there, because Dad was point blank. He's like, I don't want to go to a long-term care facility. Okay.
What are their wishes?
Well, and having that conversation was so enlightening, because it's like, all right, then we're going to need home care, right? And of course that carries with it a separate cost associated with it. Great. But to me, it's always important to align the goals, the wishes, the values, find the conduit to have the discussion. And I find, especially as we're talking to clients, a lot of them the parents are not ready to have that conversation, even with their 60-year-old child, right?
Who wants to talk about debt? I mean, it's an uncomfortable conversation.
But even sometimes it's I don't want them to know one way or the other. Recently I did a plan for a household where we're working with the child, right? I mean, they're in their 50s, right? But the child, and they asked us to come in and revisit their parents' financial situation. And I found the resistance, hands down, was from the parents. And especially in this case, because the parents did not have the means that the child did, right? And so the parents didn't want the child in the room, right? And this is, let's just say an 80-year-old parents, right? They didn't want the child in the room, which I'm fine, obviously, but it becomes a conversation where at some point that wealth is going to transfer, and I think about my in-laws, right? We're their financial advisor as well, right? And my goal coming into that was not to know how much money they had. Right. My goal was to know, are they going to be a burden on me or not?
Yep.
And as soon as I check that box, I'm like, all right, how do we optimize from here, right?
Exactly.
And make this better, make this bigger. And it's I have a conflict, right? Because naturally my wife is a beneficiary. So I have to abstain in certain conversations simply because I'm a fiduciary on the investment side.
Right.
Right. But this is one where it becomes a very dynamic conversation. Yep. So what else with regards to parents?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest, just, again, not just leaving the numbers, but like, what are their wishes, right? And just kind of making sure you understand that who plays the different roles. So you have multiple siblings, and maybe your parents set up to say, oh, I want y'all all to be power of attorney. Well, my parents are in Mississippi, my sister's there, she's kind of boots on the ground, I'm here. So there's some things that naturally would make more sense for her to do than to me. And it's just good having that conversation, right? Because maybe your parents think, I don't want to hurt their feelings by not having them both act equally in this role. And it just doesn't necessarily need to be that way. So who does what?
I want to pull on that more, right? Because and maybe selfishly, I'm thinking about my situation and some that I've encountered with clients. But I think it's extremely important to have the discussion of who the parties. And maybe we should dive into what does that mean. And really, it's an estate planning conversation. Yep. But having the fluidity between mom and dad and child, now, of course, we're excluding grandchildren from this discussion, but being able to be transparent, not necessarily about the assets and the means, but it comes back to the conversation of, all right, well, who is going to be in charge in certain instances? I think about my mom, right? My mom, I am financial everything for her, but her sister is a registered nurse. And so to me, that's a very natural, like if something were to happen, as long as her sister's, not only am I going to have that conversation, but I would probably want her making those decisions.
Absolutely.
Right? That's my assumption. But unless I have that conversation.
Just an assumption.
Yeah, it's an assumption, right? And frankly, I think it's important and again, I'm thinking about me, but having the documents in place to align those assumptions. And I think the perfect segue for any child to talk about anything related to wealth and estates is to have that conversation from an estate planning lens.
Yep.
Right. And making sure that everyone is aligned in that regard.
Absolutely. Because you haven't had the conversations, you get to the documents, if you're having to step in one of these roles for your parents, they're incapacitated, something happens, that's already a very emotionally difficult time.
Yep.
So imagine doing that and trying to say, well, I guess mom and dad wanted this because we're both listed here, or I'm only listed here. Why weren't you here? In terms of healthcare directive and financial power of attorney. So I think it's just good to say, let's make sure we all know what we should be doing and have that in place.
Well, and frankly, we talked about my dad and his care, but let's just say, and my parents are divorced, but let's just say mom and dad are alive. Well, if dad had something happen to dad, what does we want to have happen with mom, right? And so I'm thinking of my in-laws at this point, right? They both live in Massachusetts and both very healthy, right? No reason to even entertain that conversation. But I could tell you right now, if something happened to my father-in-law, it's a very clear conversation of my mother-in-law is going to be coming near us.
Right.
And it's simply because, but she might not want that, right? Like that's my vision. And so that's why I think this conversation is just so important.
Yeah.
It's a very different conversation than for the kids, right? The kids, it's let's just say educational. We're trying to align values.
Yep.
I think with parents, it becomes that one around intent.
Absolutely. Well, not to leave it all with like death and incapacity and all these terrible things. Also the positive side. I've had a lot of clients where they'll set up 529s for their grandkids, right? They're fully funding them. And, it's like, well, gosh, what does your daughter think? Or, are they saving as well? Are we overfunding the accounts, right? So I don't know. That's a good point, right? They didn't ask beyond, hey, what's the social? We want to set something up. And so I think that's also huge to say, hey, let's get aligned with how we're funding.
I love that
like
you brought that
education.
up, because especially when we're in a situation where grandpa and grandma are doing something for the grandkids. Again, I'll use my example. My dad set up 529s for my kids, and he started contributing to them. Very generous, by the way. But I noticed it wasn't a every year type of thing. And it took us having a conversation of what is your intent here?
Exactly.
And, for him, it was, all right, I set it up, right? And great, because I didn't want to have those things overfunded. Now, truthfully, right, I think about my case, they're in his name for the benefit of my children. He has every right. It's his money. He can change those 529s to be one of his other grandchildren who might have a little bit more of a need. But from a planning perspective, I think it's important to know, like, is that pot of money going to be available for education expenses along the way?
Exactly.
And again, it's alignment of goals. And I think about this whole estate planning wealth conversation and why it's so important to align the generations, simply because a decision that grandpa and grandma make can have an impact on.
Absolutely.
And related to that conversation, just because we're going down the road of college planning, it's actually better to have 529s in grandpa and grandma's name than it is the kids. Because if the kids are in a lower income level that could qualify for financial aid or more merit-based scholarships, assets that grandpa and grandma have don't count on the FAFSA, whereas mom and dad's assets do.
Exactly.
So I think the moral of this conversation is have the conversations.
That's it.
Have the conversations as early as we possibly can. When you're thinking about your kids, it's get them started with things that will ultimately resonate with you, with them. I loved you brought up the stock, right? So investing in things that they will be purchasing or that they're interested in, it gets them engaged so early on. It's so easy. Like I think about my kids right now. I mean, and you're giving me homework, right? Because I got them invested in ETFs. Well, I mean, that's not something that they're going to resonate with at all. But it's a good investment strategy.
Exactly.
Right? But,
it can be a share, right? Just buy a share so they can see it and you can watch it together.
And so have that conversation with them early on. Mine are 6, 5, and 1, so I'll take the 1-year-old off. But the 6 and 5-year-old, sure, they're old enough now that they can start thinking about that. But then I love the conversation on the estate side, right? With mom and dad, and then integrating it in a financial plan a little bit more holistically. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
We talked a lot today.
They're important conversations, tough conversations, right? But important.
But another great point you made was it's not all about death, right? Like there's some positives about all of this, right? And I think alignment of that is so important because, frankly, grandpa and grandma have their values too that might not be mom and dad's values, but they ultimately want to have those impacting the children, the grandchildren as well. Yeah. We're going to have to do more on this. Thank you for the time today. This was great.
Thank you. It was fun.
Appreciate it. Thanks. The previous podcast was intended for general information purposes only. The information discussed is no substitute for personalized investment advice from Bogart or another investment professional. Different types of investments involve varying degrees of risk, and it should not be assumed that the future performance of any specific investment, strategy, or service will be profitable, suitable, or successful. Bogart is not a law firm or accounting firm, and no portion of its services should be construed as legal or accounting advice. There is no guarantee a client will experience a certain level of results if Bogart is engaged. Our brochure describing services and fees can be found at www.bogartwealth.com.